Hey everybody, welcome to week 4. Let's jump right in. So I want to start today just with a few reminders of where we're at. This is actually a part of the quarter where I often have to remind students that you got to stick with the regular rules of college that we always have to follow, and the software is more intricate than ever. So don't plagiarize. And literally anything you're pulling from content that's more than a 2-word segment that's taken directly from something, you've got to put quotation marks around it, you've got to cite it. Anytime you're using a theory or a concept from somebody you've read this quarter already, you've got to explain it using their words and give them credit. So keep that in mind as you're doing these assignments, especially these big ones. Part 1 is right around the corner in just 2 weeks. I'm going to talk about it today. Hopefully you'll feel a little better about it by the time this lecture is over. Part 2 is right around the corner. We're going to talk about what is socialization and what is my social identity. So I want to plant that seed today as the central component of this class. We're really going to dig into what are these papers about. And another reminder that as we get to the section of the class where there's periodic quizzes, if you take a quiz on time and you don't like your grade, send me your reading notes and I'll replace the grade with the reading notes as long as they're thorough. All right, so we dug into this a little bit already in our first 3 weeks, and we've realized perspective is everything when it comes to identity. We have all grown up in slightly different worlds, and at the base of who I am is something that we're calling a social identity, the thing that I feel like makes me and makes me different than that person next to me. And I pulled just a few examples from the last 20 years or so of US culture to remind us how disparate these different views can be. During the pandemic, wearing a mask and vaccinating would be seen by some as anti-patriotic and by others as patriotic. Kneeling during the national anthem, which was right before the COVID pandemic happened, another big scandal that we had that went both way in the news, and people lost their careers, and there were a lot of people that were angry about it. Owning a gun in the United States, supporting that one politician we all know about, different one in all of our minds, of course. These are things that some people say that's so patriotic, good for you, and other people see as almost anti-American. And that is part of a lot of cultures. The US just airs those grievances a lot louder, but most cultures have different aspects where people can feel incredibly different about the exact same behavior. And that's why it's so important for us to dig to social identity. How is it we all grew up in the same culture if we've all lived in the US, or if large groups of us have lived in the US, but we can look at that group and realize I'm so different than so many of these other people. Why is that? And as we keep going, another reminder. It isn't to say we're not the moral police here. We're not philosophers that have been studying for 100 years and can finally label something correct or not. We're not looking for right or wrong. We're looking for how things work in this class so that when you encounter something that might feel shocking or off-putting, you've got some way to navigate it and figure out what's going on. So let's jump into some of this. Beverly Tatum, who is writing from an American perspective, a U.S. white woman, middle-aged, who's got what she's calling privilege, and she's trying to describe how cultures work by using the United States as an example. But I want to focus on the term she uses that will be a framework of all cultures, dominant versus subordinate identities. And we often think of those as mean terms, and often they do play out that way in real time. But dominance just means you're in charge of a space. And we should keep this in mind when we try to think about how did these places get the way they are? How did the United States get to a place where every president that's ever been elected was a man, where the majority of CEOs are white men, where the majority of prosecutors and judges are white men? How did this happen? And we can run the clock back and realize that it didn't necessarily take evil people with evil intent. It took a group of people moving to an area and then desiring things that they wanted to build institutions to fill those needs. A good example of this would be that if I was a vegetarian, a vegan, just to make this point stick, and 20 of my friends and I moved to some area, we build a city, we make water, cleaning supplies, we make sewage, we get trash collection, we build infrastructure, and we start to think to ourselves, it'd be nice to have some places to eat. We should get some restaurants built. There is not a chance in hell that one of us is going to build a restaurant that serves just meat or that even serves meat at all. No one lives there who eats meat. So we're going to build institutions that serve our needs. No big deal, right? We all are happy. We can buy different vegetable-based products everywhere, and no one's complaining about not getting meat until somebody comes to town to visit or somebody moves in and they do eat meat. In that simple aspect of their cultural identity, their social identity that is different, it's suddenly going to make them feel out of place in a very key way. They're going to be looking for food and not sure where to fulfill a very basic human need. And this is how dominant and subordinate identities work. If I'm the vegetarian, I'm going to be looking at them saying, this isn't mean. We didn't do this on purpose. I'm not a bad guy. You just showed up. Did you bring any meat with you? We're all horrified by you eating meat in the first place. I'm not going to feel like I'm being a bad person very often when I'm in a dominant identity or that I'm getting some sort of unwarranted power. But from a subordinate identity, it feels that way quite often. And of course, we're using a funny example of vegetarians and meat eaters, but it plays the same way with our history of race in the United States, with our history of gender in the United States, with our history of socioeconomic status in the United States. Dominant and subordinates happen because the group of people in power build institutions to serve their needs, and then it's hard for them to notice how much the lack of other institutions or the design of the institutions that exist actually oppress the groups that are in subordinate identities. Now think of this idea of a melting pot. He mentions in the second article we read that instead of thinking of the United States as a melting pot, we should think of it as a salad bowl. You don't turn on the radio and hear a station with a rock song and then a rap song and then a country song and then a Mexican music song. No, you tune into each one separately. You don't go to a restaurant generally that serves Mexican food, Italian food, American food, French food, all those things. No, you go to each restaurant. Now they might be side by side, like in a salad, but in the United States, they seldom melt together. And again, thinking about dominant and subordinate identity, imagine the different perspectives, the different watching somebody kneel on the sideline and having a very different reaction than someone else. Somebody in a dominant identity is probably going to feel like it's a salad bowl. I mean, look at all these different radio stations I can tune to, and those tend to change as the people that move into an area change. It feels like there's lots of other cultures very nearby. There is no melting pot. But if you're a subordinate identity, you probably feel very much like you've had to adapt. You've had to adjust and melt in. Make sure you don't stand out too much or you're going to draw some attention. And so again, this dominant and subordinate thing is a very real identity factor that plays out in real time. All right, I do this periodically because this is the point of the quarter where you're going to be writing papers and hopefully taking good notes and trying to remember, where was that theory of cosmopolitanism? Week 1, week 2? So just as a reminder, we've got some basic citations. The cycle of socialization was Haro on week 3. U.S. melting pot, Gary Weaver. Dominant versus subordinate groups, Beverly Tatum. Cultural building blocks, Martin Nakayama. And we're now on to value orientations. We're going to build some more lingo today to talk about how do these cultures work. Now, just like last week, I wanted to take a look at a piece of media from the United States that can give us an idea of how to play with some of the frameworks we picked up this week when we're talking about cultural orientations, which is where we're headed in just a second from the reading.
I need you in my office.
Okay. Thanks again.
Hey, is this going to take a while? I just ordered from Thai Garden and they're pretty fast.
So you like spicy food? That's interesting. Close the door, please.
Why is that interesting?
Todd, we decided to restructure order fulfillment.
Restructure how?
Offshore the whole department.
It's a good one.
I'm not kidding. Check out this spreadsheet. Any American job that's done on the phone or online, it's going overseas. The savings are incredible.
This is some kind of weird psychological test you're pulling on me, right, Dave? It's like a ritual hazing for the annual review.
It's not quite time for your review, Todd. You've been working here coming up on 4.5 years, not 5.
You can't outsource order fulfillment. Half our catalog is patriotic knickknacks. If a factory worker from Wisconsin calls the 800 number to buy this and gets a person in another country, he's going to flip out.
That's where the accent training comes in.
You expect me to walk in there and tell everyone, I'm sorry, but your jobs have been outsourced.
I'll do it.
So I'm fired too.
No, not at all.
But I manage fulfillment. Now you don't need me here.
You're right, we don't need you here. We need you in India. You give it up, plus your pension and medical, and you'll be out there in a bad job market with no unemployment benefits. Ask these guys in about 20 minutes.
No, no way. No, I'm not going to India to train my own replacement.
All you need to do is visit the call center, improve the minutes per incident, and make sure the new guy's up to speed.
Where does this new guy get paid?
$500,000 rupees. That's $11,000 a year to do your job. And it's 8 heads for the price of 1. What are you gonna do?
I'm not going to India.
Train station.
Hi, can you take me to the train station? Oh, crap. No, sir, sorry, I wanted a taxi.
No problem.
Okay, sorry, thanks. Let me just grab my bag. Thanks. Ow, jeez! Whoa, no, stop! Go!
011 down Mumbai Chennai Express will leave from platform number 9 at 2 o'clock.
Hi. You are liking India?
It's interesting.
That's the best country. No problem. Hey, no problem. You just jump. What? You jump. You must jump that first. There's no room. Jump. Jump. You must jump. Jump. Jump.
So some really interesting examples of, in particular, collectivism versus individualism operating on a cultural level at the end there. And we'll actually use that clip to go back and discuss some of these orientations that we're going to talk about in just a minute that I expect to show up not just in your weekly discussion post, but also in your part 1 project and your part 2 project. But that is actually offered for extra credit. So if you want to watch the entire video, you can find it under the extra credit section at the top of the modules. And do what we're going to do today. Talk about how some of the theories and definitions and orientations provided by our authors are applicable to what we were talking about. We're also going to talk about power distance as it relates to people in positions of power, whether that's an official political person or somebody with religious authority or a paternal figure in authority over you or somebody at a job like we saw here. And you could see that there's a difference between the United States where power distance is low. He and his boss are talking about firing everybody. He's eating potato chips in front of him, not a big deal. As you watch this movie, you'll notice in other cultures, he is the boss and they treat him in a very high power distance fashion. How are you doing? They call him Mr. That sign for Mr. Toad was him because his name is Todd and they mispronounced it. So there was some cultural clashing that actually left him feeling very disjointed. And then one more thing, and again, we'll circle back to these when we really define the terms, but communication style. We saw that he comes from the United States where we have very segmented lifestyles. When we meet people that we just bumped into, we're very polite and official, and we often save our poor behavior for our people we know, our family members. We see them and we're like, hey, how you doing? But when you're on the street, you smile at strangers because we live in a business-oriented world and we have a segmented culture and we want to just get through the interaction and move on. Now, in other countries where that orientation is flipped and they have a unified culture, meaning their life and their home life and their work life are not very separated. They're largely the same person in both places. They don't put on a face in a performance to say, hey, how you doing? Can I get you anything today? For 8 hours. They act the same way. And so they swarm him when he comes out of the airport and they're pushing at each other and saying, no, this is my customer. You usually won't see something like that in US business context, whereas as soon as he lands, it's right in his face. So again, some things we'll circle back around to. I want to flag this as we go by. Generalizations versus stereotypes. This class isn't about building stereotypes so that when you land, you can figure out what's everybody here like. No, unfortunately, we couldn't do that anyway, but it is about generalizations. And in the very end of that clip we just saw, we saw a gentleman standing over to the side who seemed very different than the other people that all seemed to be reflecting the new culture that this guy just showed up in. And so he goes over to that person who makes him suddenly feel a little bit more safe, comfortable, at home. He takes him up on the offer, and the guy immediately jumps into some cultural norms like driving fast. He's in a rickshaw instead of a taxi. He's like, let's get out of here. Those things are still there, and there's something to be said about generalizations. It doesn't mean everybody you meet by any means is going to be the same in any way, but it means that when people grow up in a culture, it's the water they live in, it's the air they breathe, it's the smog they inhale, to use Tatum's term. It programs them in ways that you will see patterns with the people that live nearby them that often they won't notice themselves. Cultural identity versus social identity. Very similar to what I just said, a big culture can have lots of things in common. If you've lived in the United States for more than 3 days, you know what McDonald's is. Just about guaranteed, they're everywhere. Whereas you might not necessarily know much about the Mormon church. One of these is your big cultural identity, shared with almost everyone around you. And if you grew up adjacent to Mormons or in the Mormon church, you probably have a social identity that has more to do with your immediate network that is shared with them and not so much with the larger culture, although you still share a lot in common with the larger culture. That's what we're trying to flesh out here. That's what we're trying to really divide up and make sure we're doing this work in the right way. So I want to present a 3-level dynamic that we'll also use a few times in this class. How should we think about how cultures are built? Number 1, the universal level, what everybody does. Every human on the planet eats. We all make art. We all have music. We all have something like love. We all have sex. We all have sleep. We all have different things that make us human at a universal level. And then we have a big culture, a collective level, where we do these things a certain way. We don't do punishment the same way here as we might see in Saudi Arabia, but both cultures universally do punish when people do something that breaks the social code. The collective level is, how do we as a large group decide to do these things? What are the normal rules of dating and sexuality versus universally everybody does that? And then, of course, where we're headed for this class over and over is social identity, the individual level. what makes you you in ways that are different than those around you. And we're going to really try to, in this first part of the project for this class, this paper that's due in a couple weeks, we're going to try to get at how did that happen? What experiences did you have that made you feel the way you feel that is different from those around you? And how does it feel to interact with the world in that body, with that identity? So we're headed right toward these things, right? Things that help us understand cultural values. So far, we're staying vague and saying, what makes me me? What's different than the bigger culture as a whole? But what we want is terms and theories we can use to explain it. So power distance. We just hit on an example of it with Todd talking to his boss. There's very low power distance. They can basically curse at each other. It's friendly. They're kind of chummy. You could imagine them going out for beers after work. There's not a ton of space between people who have power and people who don't. And this tends to be a United States big culture thing. The idea that we should be able to speak to our bosses. You can all send me an email anytime and not be intimidated. If you see me in public, you could wave, right? Other cultures you'll show up at, it isn't like that. And you can imagine how even in the United States, perhaps you grew up in a religious small C culture, a small group of people, maybe even just your family or a small church, that taught you a slightly different rule for power distance, such as respect your elders, respect the leaders of the church, respect those in authority. You might actually have a higher power distance than the regular Joe Schmo in culture. And we can start to use these specific theories and terms like power distance to explain specific things about each of us that make us who we are, and more importantly, why we are the way we are. I grew up in a religious organization that gave me a deeper sense of respect, that made me feel more compelled to keep that high power distance. Make sense? Masculinity versus femininity. We hit on some of these already, and granted, they're somewhat stereotypical in how they're using the terms masculine and feminine, but across the world, when you look at cultures, you can classify orientations that tend to tip one way or the other. Is communication expected to be calm, reasonable, reserved, and unemotional generally? Or is it expected to be emotional, hot, quick, and direct? And you'll notice in the United States, in public, we actually tend to expect unemotional, calm, smile, even if you don't mean it, let's do the business. In other cultures, as we saw, that's not the case. In the US, you might have come up in a culture that taught you to be a little more direct. Maybe you were in some sort of household that professed social justice. Maybe you were taught to go out and protest. And because of that, you tend to fall more on what we're seeing described as the masculine side in expressiveness and direct talking. Uncertainty avoidance. This one's probably easy to spot. The United States tends to be very low uncertainty avoidance. Bet on the stock market. Throw some money on that football game this week on the online sports app. Go to the casino and roll the wheels on the one-handed bandit. We don't mind high risk in the United States. We have a cultural history that's replete with it, so that's where that mentality comes from. But there's a lot of other countries where that is not acceptable, where it would be really looked poorly upon if people were risking the family inheritance. And you can imagine, we can draw some connections already. Collectivist cultures tend to be more risk avoidance. They enjoy uncertainty avoidance. They avoid situations that are uncertain. Whereas individual cultures like the United States, makes sense. It's my money. I'll do what I want with it. We tend to embrace uncertainty. And long-term, short-term orientation. Are we the sort of people that look for tomorrow or next week and the vacation we're going to take to Vegas for a couple of days and get smashed drunk? Or are we a culture that tends to look 50 years in the future, 500 years in the future? Do we plan for our own lives and often leave a mess for the generations that come after? Or are we having a long, focused view where we see the world as bigger than just us and our generation? And again, you can see the US tends to fall on short-term, but also that you might come from a culture. This is another one where religious upbringings are a great example of a long-term orientation, where you actually grew up in a group where you can find very specific life lessons you learned that made your social identity different than the larger social identity. And of course, one more time, the reason for this class is that when these things clash and you're not expecting them, when you don't know that power distance is a thing that really works the way we're saying, and that can make you feel out of place and anxious when you encounter differences than what you expect, you can have a much harder time walking through that. Whereas if you get a cold shoulder from a teacher after talking about this, it's easy to say, I wonder if this is a high power distance thing. The teacher's just not used to students talking to them. All right, so let's go through one more time. We've talked about some, but here's the quick snapshot of it. And you might want to remember where the video is. So if you ever want a quick definition of these things, you can come back. These are all from Hofstede. Individualism versus collectivism, rice fields and teamwork, groups of people trying to accomplish something, versus American clock punching and single worker stations and let me do it myself. Power distance, like we just talked about. South Korea meets a British manager. You can imagine there might be some sort of misunderstanding in the American guy being like, how you doing, buddy? Oh, yeah, it was a great trip. In the South Korean person maintaining a high power distance and almost feeling like, man, this guy's really pushy. He's not being respectful. Not noticing those cultural differences can cause all sorts of conflicts. Abrasive versus fighting uncertainty. Again, as we talked about in relationship to Todd, he didn't seem to like the style of embracing uncertainty that they were using in India. He seemed to have a social identity that was not very risk embracing. He didn't like being in that rickshaw, for example. But think about whether you have a flexible lifestyle or a structured lifestyle. In the United States, you might think of it as structured for most people, but a lot of people get to break that norm. Drive to achieve versus quality of life. In the US, generally, we have a drive to achieve. We ask kids what they want to be when they grow up, meaning what do you want to do to get lots of money to work? How are you going to define yourself by what you do? There are other cultures where the leaning is towards how are you going to live your best life? How are you going to fulfill your mission? Things like that. Again, you can imagine not only how different groups in the United States might have different social identities based on different things they grew up with in regard to this, but also how traveling abroad and encountering a different orientation unexpectedly might be very anxiety producing. Universalism versus particularism. Is everybody treated the same, universalism, or are there particular rules for particular people? In the United States, you'll find that we claim universalism. We have Lady Liberty with a blindfold, Lady Justice rather, holding the scales of justice with a blindfold, like she can't see. But we also know that when people get charged with lots of crimes and they're rich and they're famous, they still walk the street. They a lot of times never do a day in jail. Sometimes big people fall, but even when it happens, they're treated differently through the process. Whereas if you're poor and you're arrested, you might not even be able to afford a $300 bond, and a totally different game is going to play out. Neutral versus emotional. We just talked about this one. In the United States, we tend to be calm because we are business oriented. We want to get right down to business and get things done. In neutral versus other countries and other cultures where you'll find very expressive styles. And you can think of some South American cultures where this is the norm. Levels of involvement. Are lifestyles segmented or unified? Business oriented in the US. So it is totally normal to have 8 hours a day to work and then come home and check out of that frame of mind. I don't want to talk about it. That's not what I do when I'm at home. I'm not going to keep doing it at home for fun because that's not why I go to work. It's strictly for money. Whereas other cultures actually try to ingrain what they do for a living into who they are to feed their identities. Locus of control. Do you feel like you're in control of your life as much as you can be and you want to be in control of your life? Or do you feel like control is hard to grasp and out there somewhere and there's nothing I can do? Do you have an internal locus of control or do you feel like it's out there somewhere? Do you have insurance because you feel like I can do some things to change my lot in life and make sure the boogeyman doesn't come for me? Or are you at the mercy of chance events? Or another way to say this, though, might be, do you feel like the best you can hope for in life is that I've got to grab the reins and try to keep this show under control? Who else is gonna? Or that out there is some sort of higher power, an external from you locus of control that's running the universe. And here we see big differences between different groups in the United States. So keep that one in mind. And finally, time orientation. Are we a commodity? Time is worth money in the United States, or are we more a It's endless. Time is just about enjoying it and getting there. Are we like, be there on time or pay the price? Or are we like, no big deal if people show up late? Again, individualist culture like the US, very business oriented, money oriented. We are time oriented towards commodity. We expect people to be there on time. And this can really be anxiety producing if you travel abroad and encounter something different. Because if you're used to people showing up on time and you're showing up on time and they're not there, ooh, it can be frustrating. Oh, one more, sorry. High versus low communication. Warning here, this one always hits me as backwards from what it is. So remember, high context communication means I'm not going to say very much. I'm going to make my eyes big and I'm going to change my tone. And you're going to have to read between the lines. But I might only say something like, stop it. And you can read from the context of what I'm doing. He's serious. Oh, he must mean that I'm tapping something and annoying him, or whatever the context is. On the other hand, low context means I'm going to give you all the information. You're not going to have to try to figure out what I'm talking about by thinking about it. So I would say, stop it right now. I don't like you tapping on that table. Put the pen down, right? Whoever's tapping right now, who gotcha. This is how different communication styles, again, can both show up in the same culture and define you differently from a social identity perspective than the big C culture, and also how you can expect a clash when you travel abroad that if you're not ready for it, it can feel disturbing. So let's use these few things, and we're almost done, I promise, but I want to practice for your discussion board this week because these asynchronous classes are really hard to keep everyone involved and to make sure we're all digging the content and using it for the post. So let's imagine you're riding with your friend in a car. He's going 35 miles an hour and he hits a pedestrian. There's no witnesses, and his lawyer tells you if you testify under oath that he was only going 20, I don't think he's going to get in any trouble. Think to yourself and pay attention as you're thinking to how you make this decision. What do you do? Now, here's what I really want you to think about, because you probably just came to a conclusion pretty fast. This side of it's pretty easy to think about for most people. We have values, we have ethics, we have general rules that we tend to stick by, and they're based on our upbringing and experience. If you've had some experience where some shit went down and your homeboy stuck with you and saved your butt, you're probably more prone to think, well, we live in the real world where you should kind of be expected to stand up and sometimes, violate your own ethics to protect your friends. You've got a slightly collectivist mindset, actually, compared to the United States. Whereas if you grew up in a group where morals were emphasized, where we have to be universal and hold the same standard for everybody, for any number of reasons, you might have immediately said no. Now think about what your friend can expect. And I think we can catch some more of the gears moving if we start to say to ourselves, does our friend, if he's lived in the United States his whole life, have a right to expect us to lie? Does he have a right to expect us to really think about, like, it might be a maybe? I mean, like, should he expect that it's not going to be an automatic no? Or should your friend, if he's lived in the United States, expect that the answer is probably going to be no? And I think here again, if we were in a class space talking as a group, we would spot and notice that all of us have different perspectives on this that are probably based on different upbringings, different social identities. So in this case, I could talk about how the United States preaches universalism, but they practice particularism. And I tend to feel like I'm universal. I'd never lie for somebody. But as soon as it's my friend, I'm like, and there's no witnesses. Okay, maybe he was going 20. I have the same mentality, big C culture. I grew up in the United States. It's how I was programmed. But also, as soon as I said that, I have this double check in my brain that's from reading philosophy for the last 10 years that makes me say, now hold on. Is this a standard that you would really be able to carry out in your life? Because you can't build inconsistency in without actually producing anxiety from cognitive dissonance, blah, 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 blah. And that fires up. And suddenly I'm like, different conclusion all of a sudden. I can find different cultural frameworks that define who I am socially, and I could write this paper using them if I was thinking through situations like this. So just a shout out to get you thinking. So here is your prompt. As you're getting ready to go wrap this thing up, here's what I want to give you. It'll sound familiar because we've gone over it a few times today using different terms from the readings that you need to use in your actual paper. But I want to be thinking about, What is the most salient aspect or aspects of your social identity? Where does it come from? And how do you believe that that social identity shapes the lens through which you see the world, through which you interact with those who might be viewed as different from you? And of course, almost all of you will talk about dominant identities and subordinate identities because we both have both. I've mentioned to y'all before, I have felony convictions, but I also teach inside a prison. And so a good example of where dominant and subordinate plays out in real time for me is if I get pulled over on the way to the prison to teach a class and the cop runs my record, my criminality is going to make me subordinate. He is going to be dominant. He's going to be looking in my window and saying, I've got some clues that say I might want to suspect you of some crimes. Can I search the car? The second I get in front of that classroom in the prison, that's a dominant identity because I'm looking at a group of students who don't know if they can trust their teacher, who don't know if their teacher really understands what they're going through. And when they hear, he's been here, suddenly it works differently in the minds of the people I'm speaking to. And that's what we're talking about in this class is how is your body and your reaction to the world going to play out in real space and time? So here's how I think you should be thinking about this as you move forward. And again, we've gone over this and called the human level, the universal level. I like thinking about this in terms of there's things that all humans just do. All of us, we gotta eat. We've gotta breathe. As groups, we will definitely make something artistic, something musical. It just happens with every culture ever. We all do drugs. Now, how do we do these things and what sorts of rituals go along with them? Now we're getting to big C culture, capital C, the big United States culture of McDonald's and rock and roll and Bruce Springsteen and things that we could say almost anybody that understands even a little about America. Guns, free speech, God and liberty, things that define almost everybody that's lived here. Whether you reject them or not, you are part of the soup where that is the norm. It's not unusual to hear somebody yell it in a crowd, right? It defines who we are. Big C culture. Now, I want to add a piece that we didn't really get to with the other ones, which is what about the difference between, say, Alabama and Chicago? They're both big C American culture, very different norms that you're going to get just from living anywhere in Alabama versus anywhere in Illinois, generally, especially if you're in the big city. We can think of those things as sometimes tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, sometimes a million or so people that are still a huge group, and they're not all the same, but you learn certain things from those groups. Minnesota Nice is a good example of this, or the different styles like Southern hospitality, where you might say, oh, bless her heart, and what you mean is, oh, she's so stupid. Different ways of just communicating that are colloquial that let you express what all humans express in a way that's unique to your group. Small C culture. Make sense? And then finally, where you're going for these papers, social identity. As you're digging, you're going to get down to small C culture, and then you're going to hit pay dirt, and you're going to realize, what makes me different or the same than that community I grew up with? If you grew up in a church and that was your small C culture, and you can see how that small C culture was different than the big C United States in certain ways, how did your social identity from your family, from your parents, from your local group of friends at school, from where you lived in the community, from the things that you learned to do as a kid, that shaped differences in you that were even different than your small C culture. So that's what I want you to focus on in these papers. And again, I want you to use as many of the terms and theories and concepts and orientations that we've read about as you can to unpack these ideas and theories. As always, get with me if you need some help, if you've got questions, if you're not sure about anything. Again, I totally acknowledge the online version of this class is a bit difficult, so let's make sure we get through it together. And if you're falling behind or you're struggling, just shoot me an email and we can chat. See you next week.